It was a week after the horrific Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, and tapping could still be heard coming from inside the sunken ship's hull. There were people still alive in there, but nothing could be done to save them. Only the next year, when the ship was finally pumped out, did they discover what that tapping was. The scene haunted everyone unfortunate enough to see it for the rest of their lives. I'm going to show you the darkest side of this infamous military catastrophe, so for everything to make sense, let's start from the very beginning. Pearl Harbor had been a base in what was then the US territory of Hawaii since 1899, and it evolved into a full naval base with dry docks, fuel and ammunition storage, hospitals, barracks, and an airfield. It became the most important American naval base because in the spring of 1940, President Roosevelt decided to move the whole Pacific Fleet to Pearl Harbor. The idea Roosevelt had was that such an American force 2,500 miles closer to Japan would deter them from further aggression across Asia, and because Japan was still some 3,400 nautical miles away, without any nearby Japanese base, a surprise carrier attack was thought to be impossible. At the time, Roosevelt was told by the fleet commander himself that the move was a horrible mistake, and that it would only make the whole fleet an easy target in case, God forbid, something happened, like, I don't know, Japan attacking them. However, the president didn't really appreciate his opinion, so he was replaced, and the fleet of 8 battleships, 3 aircraft carriers, some 20 cruisers, dozens of destroyers, plus submarines, support ships, and aircraft was forward deployed to Pearl Harbor. Now, as for Japan, it had been fighting a brutal war in China since 1937, and it occupied a bunch of territory across Asia, slowly but surely positioning itself to seize the oil fields of the Dutch Indies and the rubber of British Malaya. You see, the problem that led to the attack on Pearl Harbor was that Japan didn't have oil. Roughly 80% of its oil came from the United States, and in July 1941, Roosevelt froze all Japanese assets in the US with an ultimatum to withdraw from China. So Japan was now in a position where they had a strategic reserve of oil for about 2 years, and in war conditions that burns much faster, so they knew they had to do something. But no option seemed right for them. They knew that going to war with America wasn't the smartest decision, as they estimated that the US had some 70 times the industrial capacity that Japan had. They also didn't want to waste years of fighting just to give up all that territory they now had. So when it became obvious that war with the United States was inevitable, Admiral Yamamoto, who controlled almost all of Japan's warships and was personally against the war, proposed a plan. He threatened to resign his position and said that if war with America had to happen, it must begin with one big gamble, the only move that gave Japan a chance to win. He knew that a prolonged war of attrition was going to play to America's strength 10 times out of 10, so he wanted the war to begin with a single annihilating blow on day one. If this succeeded, the US Pacific Fleet would get destroyed at anchor in one morning. American morale would collapse, they'd negotiate, and Japan would keep the empire. It was a desperate plan, but the only one that might actually work. Most of the Japanese thought that Yamamoto had lost his mind, and that sending the entire carrier force 3,400 miles across the empty Pacific, hoping to achieve complete surprise, was a wild bet. But as time passed, and with no better plan on the table, it was eventually accepted. Now, the water at Pearl Harbor is shallow, about 40 feet, which was actually one of its defensive features, and both the Americans and the Japanese knew this. You see, the aerial torpedoes of the time couldn't work in water that shallow. The plane comes in low and releases the torpedo above the water. The thing splashes in and runs to the ship to hit it below the waterline. After getting released from a plane, a torpedo plunges at least 100 feet deep into the water, before it pulls back up to its proper running depth. But in such shallow water, all aerial torpedoes of the time would bury themselves in mud, so if Japan wanted to destroy the American fleet anchored in the harbor, they had to come up with a torpedo that could work there first. And they had been trying to make one since 1931, but what they came up with was a modification of the torpedo Type 91, which the Japanese called something that translates roughly as aerial thunder fish. It was 18 feet long, weighed 1,800 pounds, with a 450-pound explosive warhead, and it ran at 42 knots. Most importantly, this torpedo was now reworked so it wouldn't sink so deep and could be used in the shallow water of Pearl Harbor. A hit from one of these would rupture multiple compartments at once, and it wasn't going to be a good day for whatever ship it hit. 100 of them were ready for the attack, but besides the torpedo, Japan also didn't have an aerial bomb that could go through the heavy steel deck armor of an American battleship. So they took an old 16-inch armor-piercing shell, which were designed for battleship duels and to penetrate ship armor. They streamlined them and added tail fins, and the thing now weighed 1,700 pounds and could go through 6 inches of deck armor when dropped from 10,000 feet. And remember these bombs, because one of these would be important for later. Japanese aircrews trained intensively on a southern Japanese island where the terrain roughly resembled Pearl Harbor. They practiced for 2 months, dropping these new torpedoes and the new shell bombs to penetrate ship decks, and doing fighter sweeps over harbor mock-ups. The strike force was assembled in mid-November, well away from any prying eyes, and it was a composition no navy had ever put together before. All 6 of Japan's fleet aircraft carriers were in one task force. Around them, 2 fast battleships, 2 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser, then 9 destroyers, 3 submarines, and 8 oilers to keep them fueled across the long crossing. On November 26, Japan time, the strike force got underway, deliberately avoiding commercial ship lanes and known American patrol patterns. They sailed some 3,400 miles in absolute radio silence. By the morning hours of December 7th, Hawaii time, the task force had reached its launch point some 230 miles north of Pearl Harbor, and at 6 a.m. the first wave of 183 aircraft was assembled. Some 50 high-altitude bombers with those armor-piercing shell bombs, 40 torpedo bombers, about 50 dive bombers, and 40-something Zero fighters. The formation turned south and headed for the island, while the Americans at this point had absolutely no idea that they were coming. However, the warnings were there, which brings us to the really controversial part of this story. The US had broken the Japanese diplomatic code already in 1940, and they were reading their mail in real time. But only about 10 people knew about this, as logically it was top secret, yet no one thought it would be a good idea to give this information to, I don't know, the closest naval base to Japan, the one that'd be first on the line in case of an attack. There were messages, obviously, suggesting the planned attack that they did intercept, and Pearl Harbor got a quote-unquote war warning message stating that hostile action was possible at any moment and ordering them to deploy defensively, with clear instructions not to alarm the civilian population or make it too obvious. So the commanders at Pearl Harbor understood this more as a concern about local sabotage. Maybe someone would plant a bomb here and there to disable some ship or aircraft. So they made another horrible mistake just before the attack was about to happen. They parked all the aircraft, wingtip to wingtip, in tight rows in the open so they could be guarded better. The evening before the attack, Washington intercepted several messages that made it obvious that something big was cooking, and they frantically tried to reach Hawaii to warn them. But they'd all arrived too late. Meanwhile, 2 American privates were watching their radar screen when they saw something they'd never seen before. It was an enormous strike force that popped up on their screen around 130 miles ahead of them. They called the information center, which was empty during breakfast, and the only officer who was there answered and told them not to worry about it, because a flight of American B-17 bombers was expected that day, and that was what they were seeing on their radar. They called again a few minutes later, saying that this was unlike anything they'd ever seen before, to which they got the answer that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Quote, "Don't worry about it." Contact was lost in the radar shadow of the surrounding mountains, 22 miles from the coast, and the 2 privates shut down the radar and went to breakfast. And what the 2 privates had seen on their screen was the Japanese first wave. As for the US sailors and Marines in Pearl Harbor, it was a Sunday morning, and Sundays were days off, which meant that most men went out the night before, drinking, dancing, and chasing girls, as any normal 20-year-old would do during peacetime. So now, as the attack was about to happen, a lot of them were either still in town, just coming back to base, or sleeping it off in their bunks. Cooks were serving breakfast, the flag-raising ceremony was prepared for 8 a.m., and everything was just like any other casual Sunday. The worst thing about everyone being so laid back was that the fleet was preparing for the Admiral's inspection on Monday. So the watertight doors and hatches deep inside the hulls of the ships were left open for the inspectors to walk through every compartment, which turned out to be just catastrophic timing. Those doors and hatches were supposed to contain flooding within one or a few compartments when a ship gets damaged, and they were now all open on most of the ships in port. Most of the ammunition for the anti-aircraft guns, both on the ships and at the shore batteries, was stored locked in central magazines because of peacetime safety. It was now 7:48 a.m., and the first wave reached the base. Within 10 minutes, every major American military installation on Oahu was under attack. The airfields were hit first, so no fighters could scramble to intercept the bombers. And because the aircraft were so tightly packed to keep them safe in case of sabotage, they were the easiest targets a strafing pilot could ever ask for, and hence they were now almost all burning. Nearly the whole Army fighter strength was gone in 15 minutes, and only a few of them managed to get airborne and put up a fight. 2 pilots with P-40s that were parked away from the main base took off and started fighting the Japanese aircraft. However, many other pilots were killed trying to get their fighters in the air. A few moments into this chaos, a radio message was broadcast to every Navy ship in range. Quote, "Air raid Pearl Harbor. This is no drill." In the barracks were thousands of enlisted men, some of them still sleeping, some eating breakfast when the attack began. A 500-pound bomb crashed through the roof of the mess hall and exploded inside, killing 35 men, after which Zeros came down and strafed the building. Firefighters who raced from town just minutes after the attack also got hit, with 3 men dying and 6 wounded. At the same time, the torpedo bombers started their low runs towards the harbor, while the high-altitude bombers with those converted shell bombs started their bombing runs from 10,000 feet. Those modified torpedoes worked just as intended in the shallow harbor water, where American ships sat in tight formation. It was hard to miss. Ships were getting hit multiple times all over the place, and a ship loaded with tons of fuel and ammo wasn't the safest place to be when the fire and explosions broke out. Thousands of gallons of oil spread over the water's surface. Battleships Oklahoma and West Virginia took heavy hits at the same time. Sailors manned the anti-aircraft guns, but most of the guns were locked or had just a little ammo, so they couldn't do much. Both ships were hit by several torpedoes, and they began sinking. Now, Oklahoma rolled over 130 degrees, almost fully upside down until her masts hit the floor of the harbor. Hundreds of men were trying to jump off the ship, but hundreds more were still inside the inverted hull. 429 of them died on Oklahoma alone. At the same time, the West Virginia was hit by 7 torpedoes and 2 bombs, and started rolling the same way as Oklahoma. However, after her commanding officer, Captain Mervyn Bennion, was mortally wounded by shrapnel, Lieutenant Claude Ricketts took command and ordered counter-flooding. This means that because the ship was filling with water on one side and started to roll over, they began flooding the opposite compartments so the ship would sink evenly. This meant that it hit the bottom while the upper compartments were above the water, and hundreds of men could be evacuated. However, this also meant that several men who were in those compartments that got flooded had to be sealed behind the watertight doors and left to drown. The officer had to make this choice in order to save as many men as possible, and he knew that for this he'd have to literally kill some of his own men. Now, the absolute horror that this caused was that when those compartments were sealed, most of the sailors drowned immediately as the water came. But in a few compartments, air pockets were created, where some of the sailors were still alive inside the sunken ship, and some of them would remain there for 16 more days after the attack ended. And you're going to hear about that in a moment, but let's first continue with the attack. The Arizona wasn't hit by torpedoes, but she was hit by those high-altitude bombers with the battleship shell bombs we mentioned. One of those bombs hit the Arizona and penetrated through the armored deck and through several floors beneath it, all the way down to a magazine holding 580 tons of 14-inch shells and gunpowder. 7 seconds after being hit, it went off. The explosion effectively lifted the 33,000-ton ship out of the water and tore it in two. 1,177 of Arizona's 1,512 crewmen were killed just in that single explosion, which is nearly half of all the Americans killed that day. To make matters worse, Arizona had her oil bunkers almost completely full, so the fire burned for 2 more days after the explosion. She sank with over 1,000 dead sailors still aboard who couldn't be recovered, and she still leaks oil to this very day. The only lucky thing for the Americans was that the aircraft carriers that the Japanese thought would also be in the harbor were out on their missions, otherwise they'd also be destroyed. Within about 12 minutes of the first bomb falling, the entire harbor was burning. And in 1941, ships ran on thick black bunker oil, and they carried hundreds of thousands of gallons of it. When the ships were hit by torpedoes, that oil poured out into the harbor, and as it's lighter than water, it gathered on the surface in a thick layer all over the harbor, where it then caught fire. Do I need to mention that hundreds of men were in that water trying to save themselves from their burning ships? Some had to choose between drowning and jumping into the burning oil. Even men who didn't get soaked with burning oil were dying from oil aspiration for days afterwards. By around 8:30 a.m., the Japanese first wave had dropped everything it had and was pulling off. The harbor was now in chaos, with screaming men and burning ships. But for about 20 minutes it seemed like the attack had ended. Small boats were moving through the burning water, trying to pick up anyone still alive, while survivors tried to stop the fires. Battleship Nevada was the only one that was able to get moving, and her crew tried to exit the harbor despite already being hit by a torpedo and a few bombs. She got moving anyway and passed the burning ships, but just as she was about to exit the harbor, a minute before 9 a.m., came the second Japanese wave of 167 aircraft. But this time, the composition was different from the last wave. Now, because American anti-aircraft gunners were wide awake and alert, the low and slow-flying torpedo planes were too risky, so this time it was dive bombers and high-altitude bombers, followed by Zero fighters. The second wave didn't have the surprise anymore, so of the 29 total Japanese aircraft shot down that day, 20 were from the second wave. They now saw the Nevada moving down the channel and made her a priority target, because if they could sink her there, it would block the whole harbor for months. So they swarmed her. She was hit by 5 bombs in quick succession, and the sailors, realizing what was about to happen, turned to shore and ran her deliberately aground. The second wave was now finishing off whatever was still standing. By about 9:45 a.m., the last Japanese aircraft turned home. The entire attack lasted about 1 hour and 50 minutes, and it left the harbor torn apart in flames. 188 American aircraft had been destroyed, plus more damaged. 18 ships were sunk or heavily damaged, and the official casualty count would settle at 2,403 American dead and 1,178 wounded. The Japanese, on the other hand, had lost 29 aircraft, 5 midget submarines, and 64 men. By any measure, they had decisively won the battle. However, the dying wasn't finished for the Americans, as hundreds of men died in the days and weeks after the attack. And this brings us to the absolutely most horrifying part of this story, one I don't even have the words to describe. By 10 a.m., small boats moved through the harbor and pulled out anyone who could be helped. However, within the first hour after the attack, the rescuers realized the problem they now had. From inside the broken or overturned ship hulls, banging and tapping could be heard. Civilian yard workers from the Pearl Harbor shipyard came running towards the sound, where they realized that hundreds of men were still alive inside upside-down shipwrecks, and they were now tapping out the SOS Morse code on the hull. The men who were in lower compartments now found themselves up in air pockets in the overturned, semi-flooded ship, and everyone knew that they had to get them out as soon as possible, as air was getting thinner, fires were spreading, and water was rising. The worst case of this was Oklahoma, but it was far from the only one. Those civilians gathered and tried to save the trapped sailors. Navy officers brought them blueprints of the Oklahoma so they could figure out which compartments were where. At first, they started with cutting torches to cut the steel, but the torches set fire inside the ship because of the oil everywhere, and the men inside were in danger of getting burned alive on top of the horrible situation they were in. So they switched to pneumatic chipping hammers, but they were much slower. Now, just as they were about to cut a small hole in the ship's hull, they ran into a physics problem. You see, the compartments holding the trapped men in those air pockets had higher pressure than the outside air, and because the ship had rolled over and water came in, that trapped air was basically holding the water out from filling the compartment to the roof, which is why the men were still alive. However, the moment a rescuer cut a hole into a compartment, that trapped air leaked out, and the water went in from below. The trapped men watched as the air was getting squeezed out and the water rising, while the rescuers were frantically trying to cut out a hole large enough for a man to go through. 11 sailors managed to get out this way 32 hours after Oklahoma rolled, and 32 men in total were saved from her over the next 2 days. However, 429 men on Oklahoma still didn't make it out. Rescuers could hear the men screaming inside as the water was rising, and they couldn't cut a hole any faster, until the water reached the ceiling and filled the whole air pocket where the men were. The same happened on other ships too, like the capsized Utah. But while this was going on December 8th, a different sound was heard from the forward hull of West Virginia. The ship, if you remember, didn't roll over because counterflooding was ordered. At first, they thought that loose rigging slapping against the hull was that tapping sound, but they soon realized that someone was alive in there, knocking on the steel from inside. The rescuers tapped back from the outside to let the trapped men know they were looking for them. However, in reality, there was nothing anyone could really do. Standing within earshot of the West Virginia in those weeks was what broke the men on guard, as they knew that someone was banging from the inside and that no one could help them. Unlike Oklahoma, which rolled all the way over, and the rescuers could cut a hole from the outside, the West Virginia had sunk upright, and her hull was sitting on the harbor floor under 40 feet of water. The tapping came from the compartments deep underwater, so if they cut through the hull, the water would just go inside and drown the men before they could get out. The only way to help them was to pump out the water from the whole harbor, which wasn't possible. And as there were still hundreds of wounded and trapped, and over 2,000 dead bodies in the harbor, plus no one knew whether the next Japanese attack would come, those men in West Virginia were pretty much left on their own. The tapping stopped 2 days before Christmas. The salvage operation eventually began in the spring of 1942, with divers going inside the hulls of sunken ships. The West Virginia was being pumped out, and 66 bodies were recovered in conditions too disturbing to even attempt to describe. But it was obvious that they were still alive when the water started rising. However, the absolute pinnacle of horrors found in her was when they reached storeroom A111 in the forward hull. The first odd thing was that the room was completely dry, and then they saw 3 bodies. Around them were flashlight batteries, empty cartons of emergency rations, a freshwater tank, and, most horrifying of all, a paper calendar on the wall with a red X marked on each date from December 7th, the day of the attack, through December 23, 1941. Salvage workers were broken. Those were the 3 men who were still tapping on the hull, while no one could do anything to save them. This was pushed under the carpet for decades, and those 3 men were all listed as having died at their stations on December 7th. The truth surfaced only later when their story finally leaked out. During the whole ordeal that day, 15 Medals of Honor were earned, 10 of which were awarded posthumously, and 51 Navy Crosses, which is the Navy's second highest decoration for valor in combat. Almost all of these were awarded for selfless rescue attempts and actions that saved many more men from dying.